Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are a quiet space dedicated to examining the stories that lie in the strange and complex borderlands of human behavior. What is a life? Is it a name, a history, a collection of memories? Or is it merely a role to be played? For most, identity is a constant, an anchor in the chaos of the world. But for a select, enigmatic few, it is fluid. It is a costume to be worn, a mask to be adopted. They are the great impostors, individuals who slip into the lives of others, leaving behind a wake of confusion, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Tonight, we study the chameleon. Case 1. The case of Frederick Bourdin, the chameleon. The story of Frederick Bourdin is not a simple tale of a con man seeking riches. His was a far more profound and desperate pursuit. He was a man chasing an identity, any identity other than his own. His currency was not money, but empathy. His prize was not wealth, but a temporary sense of belonging. The media would call him the chameleon, a name that captured his uncanny ability to change his persona, but it failed to capture the deep, aching void at the core of his deceptions. Bourdin's life began in the suburbs of Paris in 1974, rooted in a sense of being unwanted. He was the child of a French mother and an Algerian father he never knew, a fact that made him an outcast in his own community. Raised first by his grandparents in poverty and later shuffled through a series of bleak orphanages and youth homes, he grew up without a stable sense of self, without the anchor of a loving family. He was a boy with no history he wished to claim, no future he could envision. And so, he began to invent them. His career as an imposter started early, and it was prolific. He was not a master of disguise in the theatrical sense. He did not use elaborate makeup or prosthetics. His tools were far more powerful. A deep understanding of human psychology, a remarkable talent for spinning convincing lies, and an almost pathological ability to mirror the emotions of those around him. His primary modus operandi, developed over dozens of impersonations across Europe, was both simple and monstrously clever. He would impersonate missing or abandoned teenagers. He understood a fundamental, heartbreaking truth. A family grieving a lost child is a family suspended in a state of desperate hope. They are vulnerable. Their desire to believe, to have their prayers answered, can be a form of blindness. It can make them overlook inconsistencies, ignore red flags, and embrace the impossible. Bourdin weaponized this hope. He would travel to a new town, find his way to a police station or a youth shelter, and present himself as a lost, traumatized boy. He would be withdrawn, frightened, speaking in broken sentences. He would claim to have amnesia or to have escaped from a terrifying ordeal, a cult, a trafficking ring, an abusive home. This performance served two purposes. It elicited immediate sympathy, and it provided a perfect excuse for his inability to recall details of the life he was about to steal. While in the care of authorities, he would begin his research. He would subtly glean information, listen to conversations, and wait for the name of a local missing child to surface. Or, in a more calculated approach, he would call missing children hotlines, posing as an official, and gather details on cases across the continent. He would learn the names, the dates of birth, the physical descriptions. He would find a match, a new skin to inhabit. Before his most famous impersonation, he had already lived countless lives. He was Jimmy, a boy from Portugal. He was a Spanish orphan named Francisco. He was a British teenager lost in France. For Bourdin, each new identity was a performance, a role to be inhabited completely. He would study the part, learning scraps of the language, adopting a new accent, crafting a new history of trauma. He found that authorities, faced with a seemingly vulnerable child, were often more willing to believe his story than to navigate the bureaucratic complexities of verifying it. This serial impersonation was not sustainable. It was a cycle of discovery and escape. Eventually, the lie would collapse. A skeptical doctor, a persistent social worker, or simply the inescapable passage of time would expose him. Borden was not a boy, and the older he got, the harder the charade became. As he entered his 20s, his face began to show the lines of a man. His voice deepened, and the youthful innocence he projected began to look like a grotesque parody. Each time he was caught, he would serve a short prison sentence, only to be released and begin the cycle anew. A ghost drifting through Europe, constantly searching for a new life to borrow. By 1997, Frederick Borden was 23 years old, but his internal age was frozen in adolescence. He was living in a youth home in Linares, a small city in southern Spain. He was, once again, playing the part of a lost teenager, but he knew his time was running out. The staff was growing suspicious. He was a man among boys, and the facade was crumbling. He needed a new identity, a new family, and a new country. He needed an escape, but this time it had to be his masterpiece. It had to be a story so compelling, so audacious, that it would transport him far away from the tightening net of European authorities. He made his way to a phone booth. He called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States. Posing as a Spanish official, he asked for a list of missing American children. He listened as the operator read the names and descriptions. He was looking for a specific profile. A boy who had been missing long enough for his appearance to have plausibly changed. A boy whose family lived thousands of miles away. A boy whose story he could make his own. And then he heard the name, Nicholas Barkley, a 13-year-old boy with blue eyes and blonde hair who had vanished from his home in San Antonio, Texas, 3 years earlier. Frederick Borden, a dark-haired, brown-eyed Frenchman in his 20s, had found his new identity. He would become Nicholas Barkley, a lost American teenager. It was his most daring role yet, a deception that would not only test the limits of his own manipulative genius, but would also force a grieving family and the world to confront the unsettling power of belief. He was about to step onto a stage far larger than any he had known before, to perform a lie that would become his legend. The chameleon was preparing for his greatest transformation. Case 2. The story of the great impostor Ferdinand Waldo Damara. If Frederick Borden was a chameleon born of trauma, a man desperately seeking the love and security of a childhood he never had, our next subject was a different creature entirely. He was not escaping a painful past, but rather a future he deemed too small, too ordinary. He was a man of prodigious intelligence, boundless charm, and an insatiable hunger for status. He did not want to steal a family. He wanted to steal respectability. His story is not one of a lost boy, but of a man who believed he could be anyone, and for a time convinced the world he was right. This is the story of Ferdinand Waldo Damara, the man who would become known, with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, as the Great Impostor. Born in 1921 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, Damara's early life was not one of abuse or neglect. His father was a motion picture operator in the city's old French Quarter, and the family was, for a time, relatively comfortable. But the Great Depression shattered their working-class stability, and the Damaras fell into poverty. It was this fall from grace, this taste of a better life followed by the sting of hardship, that seemed to instill in young Ferdinand a powerful and lifelong ambition. He was exceptionally bright, possessing a near-photographic memory and an IQ that placed him in the genius range. He felt he was destined for more than the life that was laid out for him. He lacked the discipline for formal education, but he possessed an unshakable belief in his own innate superiority. His journey began not with a crime, but with a quest for piety. In 1941, at the age of 19, he joined the Trappist monks at a monastery in Rhode Island. It was a life of silence, contemplation, and rigid structure. For a time, it seemed to suit him. But Damara's restless ambition could not be contained by a vow of silence. The monastery was too small a stage for the man he intended to be. He left and a year later joined the United States Army. It was here, in the structured, hierarchical world of the military, that his career as an impostor truly began. He quickly grew bored with the life of a common soldier. It was beneath him. He concocted a plan, forged some documents, and stole the identity of an army acquaintance. He deserted his post, leaving Ferdinand Damara behind to become Anthony Ignolia, a man with a different past and, he hoped, a better future. Under this new name, he re-entered a monastery, this time in Pennsylvania. But again, the quiet life chafed against his ego. He then enlisted in the United States Navy. In the Navy, he saw an opportunity for advancement. He used his formidable intellect and photographic memory to study medical textbooks. He felt he could be a doctor. When his lack of official credentials became a barrier, he took a dramatic step. He faked his own suicide and vanished, re-emerging into the world with a new, self-awarded identity. Dr. Robert Linton French, a PhD-holding psychologist. Under the guise of Dr. French, Damara began his first great performance. He talked his way into a teaching position at a small Christian college in Erie, Pennsylvania. He was tasked with teaching psychology, a subject he knew only from the books he had devoured. His method was simple. He would stay one chapter ahead of his students. His lectures were reportedly brilliant. He was charming, articulate, and projected an air of profound intellectual authority. He founded the college's psychology department. He was a beloved and respected member of the faculty. He was, for all intents and purposes, living the life of a successful academic. The imposture was working. His downfall came not from a slip of the tongue or a suspicious colleague, but from a piece of paper. Damara, as Dr. French, was browsing through a catalog for a who's who style directory of American academics. As he flipped the pages, he saw a familiar face staring back at him, his own. It was a biography of the Real Dr. Robert Linton French, the man whose life he had stolen. Realizing his time was up, Damara quietly packed his bags and disappeared once more, leaving a bewildered college in his wake. For the next several years, Damara drifted, adopting and shedding identities like old coats. He was a law student, a cancer researcher, a prison warden's assistant. He would find a role, excel at it through sheer brainpower and audacity, and then flee just before the curtain came down. But all of these roles were mere rehearsals for the performance that would cement his legend. It was a role so audacious, so unbelievably high stakes, that it would strain the limits of credulity. He was about to become a trauma surgeon in a war zone. In 1951, Damara, now 30 years old, crossed the border into Canada. He needed a new identity, one that was robust and verifiable. He came across the name of a real Canadian physician, Dr. Joseph Cyr. Cyr was a licensed doctor, but he was not practicing medicine at the time. Damara saw his opening. He managed to acquire copies of Dr. Cyr's credentials, and with these documents in hand, he presented himself at a Royal Canadian Navy recruiting office. Posing as Dr. Joseph Cyr, Ferdinand Damara offered his services as a surgeon. In the midst of the Korean War, the Canadian military was in desperate need of medical officers. They were not inclined to scrutinize the credentials of a seemingly qualified and willing volunteer. Without so much as a basic medical exam, Dr. Cyr was commissioned as a surgeon lieutenant and assigned to the destroyer HMCS Cayuga. The Cayuga was bound for the front lines of the Korean War. On board, Ferdinand Damara, a man who had never attended medical school for a single day, was the ship's sole doctor. His entire medical knowledge came from the textbooks he had memorized. He was a fraud, surrounded by hundreds of men whose lives could depend on his non-existent skills. For months, his duties were routine. He treated minor injuries, dispensed aspirin, and tended to the common ailments of sailors at sea. He was well liked by the crew. He was confident, compassionate, and had a soothing bedside manner. He carried off the role of a ship's doctor with aplomb. But the war would not allow the charade to remain a quiet one. One day, off the coast of Korea, the Kyuga encountered a small boat carrying wounded South Korean soldiers, victims of a nearby battle. They were brought aboard the destroyer, their bodies torn apart by bullets and shrapnel. There were 16 of them, many critically injured. The ship's captain turned to his doctor, his only doctor, and told him to prepare for surgery. This was the moment of truth. There was no escape. There was no one else to turn to. The lives of these men were in his hands. Damara, the impostor, was faced with a choice: confess his fraud and let the men die, or attempt the impossible. He chose the latter. In an act of incredible nerve, he ordered the wounded to be taken to the ship's small operating theater. He then retreated to his cabin. He grabbed a standard textbook of general surgery and, with his photographic memory working in overdrive, he began to speed-read the sections on major chest wounds and traumatic amputations. For the next hour, he crammed a surgical education into his brain. He then emerged from his cabin, scrubbed in, and began to operate. For hours he worked, his hands moving with a confidence he could not possibly have felt. He performed amputations. He extracted a bullet from a man's chest that was lodged just inches from his heart. He performed major chest surgery on another. He worked methodically, following the procedures he had just read. His performance fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and sheer intellectual horsepower. The ship's medical assistants, who had no reason to doubt him, followed his orders without question. Incredibly, he succeeded. He operated on all 16 men. Not a single one died. It was a stunning feat. News of the heroic surgeon aboard the HMCS Kyuga spread. A newspaper in Canada ran a small story, celebrating the brave Dr. Joseph Sear who had saved so many lives under battlefield conditions. And it was this small article that, once again, led to his unmasking. The story was read by a woman in a small Canadian town. She was the mother of the real Dr. Joseph Sear. She knew her son was not a surgeon in the Royal Canadian Navy. At that moment, he was a quiet general practitioner in Grand Falls, New Brunswick. She contacted the authorities. The Royal Canadian Navy began a quiet, embarrassed investigation. When the Kyuga returned to port, its celebrated surgeon, Ferdinand Damara, was discreetly taken into custody. The truth came out, but the Navy was in a difficult position. How could they prosecute a man who, despite being a complete fraud, had performed heroically and saved lives? To do so would be a public relations nightmare. In the end, they chose the path of least resistance. Ferdinand Damara was quietly discharged from the Royal Canadian Navy. No charges were ever filed. The story, however, was too good to stay quiet. It was leaked to the press, and Ferdinand Damara became an international celebrity. He was the great impostor. His story was told in a best-selling book and later, in a Hollywood film starring Tony Curtis. But fame was a curse. It robbed him of his most valuable asset, his anonymity. He could no longer drift from town to town, from identity to identity. His face was known. He tried to capitalize on his fame, making television appearances and working various jobs. But the old restlessness remained. The lure of the imposture was too strong. He continued to pull off smaller, less spectacular cons. He worked as a guidance counselor at a high school, He posed as a prison guard in Texas, where he was lauded for his progressive reforms before his past was inevitably discovered. Each time he was caught, the consequences were minor. People were often more amused and impressed by his audacity than they were angered by his deception. In his later years, Ferdinand de Mara's life took a final, poignant turn. He found a calling that seemed to synthesize his desire for service and his need for a respected role. He studied theology and, this time under his own name, became ordained as a minister. He found work as a hospital chaplain in California. The man who had once pretended to be a doctor now offered comfort and solace to the sick and dying, not with a scalpel, but with a prayer. It was the longest and most stable job he ever held. Ferdinand Waldo de Mara died in 1982 at the age of 60. His life was a profound paradox. He was a man of genius-level intelligence who never earned a degree. He was a brilliant teacher, a gifted surgeon, and a compassionate counselor, but he was none of those things. His deceptions were not malicious. They were aspirational. He did not seek to harm, but to inhabit. He saw a world full of roles he felt he could play better than the people who held them, if only he were given the chance. And so, he simply took the chance again and again, creating a legacy not of a criminal, but of a man who was, perhaps, the most accomplished and extraordinary failure of the 20th century. Case 3. The Nicholas Barclay Case and the Impostor. While the deceptions of Ferdinand de Mara were a product of ambition, a desire to occupy positions of status he felt were his due, our next case returns us to the territory of Frederick Borden. But this story, which begins as a near-identical echo of his previous impersonations, would descend into a far deeper and more disturbing mystery. It is a case that forces us to ask an unsettling question. What is worse, a lie that brings false hope, or a truth that suggests an unspeakable horror? This is the story of Nicholas Barclay and the man who claimed to be him. Our story begins in San Antonio, Texas, on June 13, 1994. Nicholas Barclay was 13 years old, a boy balanced on the precarious edge of adolescence. He was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, with a tattoo on his should-era J and in land a rebellious streak. His home life was tense. He was a known runaway, a kid who clashed with his mother, Beverly, and had a history of minor troubles with the law. That evening, after a heated argument with his mother over a phone bill, he went out to play basketball with friends. He told his older brother, Jason, that he was going to a friend's house and would be back. He never returned. Initially, his disappearance was treated as just another runaway incident. It was tragic, but not, in the eyes of the police, entirely out of character. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the hope that he would simply walk back through the door began to fade. The silence grew. For 3.5 years, the Barclay family lived in a state of suspended grief. Nicholas was a ghost, a void in their lives, his fate an agonizing, unanswered question. Then, in October of 1997, the phone rang. The call came from Linares, a small city in southern Spain, thousands of miles away. A social worker was on the line. She told the Barclay family that a frightened, traumatized boy had been found huddled in a phone booth. He was malnourished, disoriented, and claimed to have no memory of who he was. After weeks of gentle care, he had finally identified himself. His name, he said, was Nicholas Barclay. For the Barclay family, it was a thunderclap of impossible hope. After years of silence, their lost boy had been found. His story, as relayed by the Spanish authorities, was horrific. He claimed he had been kidnapped and sold into a child sex trafficking ring run by high-ranking military figures from multiple countries. He spoke of years of abuse, of being flown around Europe, of unspeakable torture. This harrowing narrative provided a ready-made explanation for his traumatized state and his presence in Spain. Nicholas's older sister, Carrie, 21 at the time, was the first to speak with him on the phone. The boy on the other end of the line was hesitant, his voice soft and tinged with a strange, unplaceable accent. He sounded different, but 3 years of trauma could change a person. Carrie, her heart overflowing with a desire to believe, was convinced. It was him. She got on a plane and flew to Spain, on a pilgrimage to bring her lost brother home. The boy she met in Spain was not the 13-year-old she remembered. He seemed older, his features different. But he was also visibly shaken, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses, his demeanor fragile. He told her more of his story, of the chemicals his captors had used on him, of the things they had done. He recognized her. He seemed to know small, intimate details about their family. Carrie's last shred of doubt dissolved. This was her brother. This was Nicholas. The boy, of course, was not Nicholas Barkley. He was Frederick Borden. This was the masterpiece Borden had been preparing for. At 23 years old, he had found his perfect escape. The story of Nicholas Barkley, a boy who had been missing for years, provided the ideal canvas for his deception. The distance between Texas and Spain gave him a geographical buffer. The story of amnesia and trauma gave him an excuse for any inconsistencies. His performance in the Spanish youth shelter had been flawless, buying him the time he needed to contact the American authorities and weave his fiction. When he learned Nicholas had a sister, Carrie, he pumped the Spanish social workers for details about her, which he then fed back to her on the phone, creating the illusion of shared memory. The United States government, accepting the identification made by the family, issued him a passport. Frederick Borden, the French impostor, officially became Nicholas Barkley, the American survivor. He flew home with his sister to San Antonio, to a family he had never met, to a life he had stolen from a missing child. When he arrived in Texas, the charade should have collapsed immediately. The physical discrepancies were not subtle. They were glaring. Nicholas Barkley had been a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Frederick Borden had dark brown hair and deep brown eyes. Nicholas had been a teenager from Texas. Borden was a 23-year-old Frenchman who spoke with a thick European accent. But the power of hope, of a family's desperate need for a miracle, can be a form of willful blindness. Borden had an explanation for everything. His accent. He explained that after years of being held captive by people from all over Europe, his own voice had changed. His hair color? It had darkened with age and trauma. The eyes? This was his most audacious lie. He told them his captors had injected his eyes with chemicals to change their color, to disguise him. He claimed it was a painful, terrifying procedure. The family, wanting so desperately for their story to have a happy ending, accepted these explanations. They saw not a French con man, but their own traumatized son, scarred and changed by an unimaginable ordeal. Borden settled into the Barkley home. He enrolled in the local high school, a 23-year-old man sitting in classes with teenagers. He studied old family photos, absorbing the details of Nicholas's life. He mimicked the family's mannerisms. He played the part of the broken survivor, prone to fits of fear and withdrawal, a performance that kept people at a distance and prevented them from asking too many difficult questions. For 5 months, the impostor held. He had done it. He had found a family. He was, for the first time in his life, living in a home, surrounded by people who seemed to love him. But not everyone was convinced. The story was too strange, too perfect. It caught the attention of a local private investigator named Charlie Parker. Parker was a burly, cynical Texan, a man accustomed to lies. He was hired by the television show Hard Copy to do a segment on the miraculous return of Nicholas Barkley. Parker went to meet the family, his instincts on high alert. The moment Parker laid eyes on the boy who called himself Nicholas, He knew something was profoundly wrong. The accent, the eyes, the entire demeanor, it didn't add up. Parker began his own quiet investigation. He started with the most basic facts. He spoke to teachers, to friends, to anyone who had known the real Nicholas Barkley. They all said the same thing. The boy who had returned was not the boy who had left. Parker's skepticism grew into a conviction. He became obsessed with exposing the fraud. He tried to talk to the family, to point out the inconsistencies, but they were steadfast in their belief. They accused him of trying to destroy their happiness. Frustrated, Parker turned to a more objective form of evidence. He managed to get a photo of the new Nicholas and compared it with old photos of the real boy. He noticed a subtle but undeniable difference. The ears. The shape and structure of a person's ears are as unique as a fingerprint. The ears of the boy in San Antonio did not match the ears of Nicholas Barkley. Parker took his findings to the FBI. The federal agents had harbored their own suspicions, but had deferred to the family's identification. Parker's evidence, however, was concrete. It was enough to secure a court order. They would take the boy's fingerprints and DNA and compare them to what they had on file for the real Nicholas. In February 1998, the final act of the drama unfolded. An FBI agent arrived at the Barkley home. Borden, seeing the agent, knew the game was over. He was taken into custody. At the federal building, his fingerprints were taken. They were matched not to Nicholas Barkley, but to a French national named Frederick Borden, a man wanted by Interpol for a string of impersonations across Europe. Faced with irrefutable proof, Borden confessed. The performance ended. He calmly admitted to the entire deception, recounting with a strange sense of pride how he had fooled them all: the Spanish authorities, the U.S. Embassy, and an entire family. Frederick Borden, the chameleon, was finally caged. He was sentenced to 6 years in a U.S. federal prison for passport fraud and perjury. But the story does not end there. In fact, the exposure of the impostor was only the beginning of a much darker mystery. Borden's confession contained a final, chilling chapter, an allegation that reframed the entire story. Why, investigators asked him, did he think the family had accepted him so readily, despite the obvious physical differences? Borden's answer was stunning. He claimed they knew he wasn't Nicholas from the very beginning. He believed they were not embracing a long-lost son. They were embracing a cover-up. Borden alleged that the family had something to hide about what had really happened to the real Nicholas Barkley. He suggested that Nicholas had been murdered, and that his impersonation was a convenient way to close the book on a troublesome police investigation. This explosive allegation turned the case on its head. The Barkley family, once seen as the victims of a cruel hoax, were now under a cloud of suspicion. The focus shifted to Nicholas's older brother, Jason, the last family member to see him alive. Jason had a history of violence and drug use. He had given contradictory statements to the police about the night Nicholas disappeared. When questioned by the FBI after Borden's arrest, Jason was evasive and uncooperative. He died of a cocaine overdose in 1998, just a year after Borden's arrival, taking any secrets he might have had to his grave. And so, the case of Nicholas Barkley remains suspended in a state of profound and disturbing ambiguity. Was the family simply blinded by hope, a group of grieving people who so desperately wanted their miracle to be true that they ignored all logic? Or was Frederick Borden, the master manipulator, correct in his final, terrifying analysis? Did he, in his attempt to steal a life, stumble into the middle of a homicide and unwittingly become the key to exposing it? The real Nicholas Barkley has never been found. He is presumed dead. His case remains an open investigation. Frederick Borden, the impostor, served his time and was deported back to France. He left behind a family shattered not once, but twice. First, by the loss of their son, and second, by the terrible possibility that the stranger they welcomed into their home was not the only one living a lie. The story is a chilling testament to the complexities of grief, the terrifying power of deception, and the dark secrets a family might keep. It is a story of two disappearances, one of a boy who vanished into the Texas night, and another of an identity, conjured from thin air, that exposed a truth far more frightening than the lie itself. Case 4. The Tinder Swindler. The impostors we have examined thus far operated in a world of physical proximity. Their deceptions required face-to-face manipulation, the adoption of a physical persona. They exploited the systems of the state, the bonds of family, and the hierarchies of institutions. But our final case brings the art of the impostor squarely into the 21st century. It is a story of a deception conducted not in person, but through the glowing screen of a smartphone. It is a tale of a man who did not steal one identity, but constructed a shimmering, flawless illusion of wealth and power, all to fuel a predatory scheme of breathtaking scale and cruelty. This is the story of the man who became known as the Tinder Swindler. His real name is Shimon Hayat, born in the late 1980s in Bnei Brak, a suburb of Tel Aviv, Israel. Unlike Bourdain, his childhood was not one of overt trauma. He came from an ultra-Orthodox Jewish family. His father was a chief rabbi. But from an early age, Hayat displayed a taste for larceny and a profound disdain for the truth. His criminal career began with petty cons and check fraud. In 2011, he was wanted in Israel for theft and forgery. To escape prosecution, he fled the country, leaving his old identity behind. It was in the borderless, aspirational world of Europe that Shimon Hayat reinvented himself. He adopted a new name, one that dripped with prestige and power: Simon Leviev. He claimed to be the son of the Israeli-Russian diamond magnate, Lev Leviev, a real-life billionaire known as the King of Diamonds. This was the cornerstone of his entire deception. By attaching himself to a name synonymous with unimaginable wealth, he created an instant aura of legitimacy. He was no longer Shimon Hayat, the petty criminal from Bnei Brak. He was Simon Leviev, the Prince of Diamonds, a jet-setting heir to a billion-dollar fortune. His stage was not a physical location, but a digital one: the dating app Tinder. Tinder, for many, is a tool for connection, a way to meet new people in an increasingly isolated world. But for Simon Leviev, it was a hunting ground. He crafted a flawless profile. His photos were a curated gallery of impossible luxury, posing on the wing of a private jet, driving a Ferrari, attending lavish parties, surrounded by beautiful people in exotic locations. The image he projected was not just one of wealth, but of a dynamic, powerful man of international business. His method was a masterclass in modern romance-based fraud. He would match with women on the app, ordinary women with careers, friends, and a hope for finding a genuine connection. He would then sweep them off their feet with a whirlwind, fairy tale romance. The first date was always spectacular. He would fly a woman to another country on his private jet, just for a cup of coffee. He would take them to five-star hotels, shower them with expensive gifts, and introduce them to his supposed business partners and his ever-present bodyguard, a man he called Peter. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly vulnerable. He would open up, telling them about the pressures of the diamond business, the constant threats against him, the loneliness of his gilded life. He made them feel special, chosen, not just another woman, but a confidant, a potential partner in his incredible world. He was not just selling a fantasy of wealth, he was selling a fantasy of emotional intimacy. This initial phase of love bombing was crucial. It was an investment. He was building a foundation of absolute trust. Once he was certain he had captured a woman's heart, once she was completely invested in their shared future, he would spring the trap. The crisis always began with a text message, usually in the middle of the night. It would be a frantic, desperate plea for help. He would send photos of himself and his bodyguard, Peter, seemingly bloodied and injured. He would claim that his enemies in the diamond trade had finally caught up with him. He would say his security had been breached, that his credit cards and bank accounts had been compromised for his own safety and could not be used. He was in danger, he was on the run, and he needed her help. This is where the deception became truly predatory. He was not just asking for a loan. He was leveraging the emotional bond he had so carefully constructed. He would ask the woman to take out a new credit card in her name, an American Express Platinum card, and give him the number. He would explain that because it was in her name, it could not be traced by his enemies. He promised, with absolute sincerity, to pay her back in a matter of days, as soon as the security situation was resolved. For the women, caught in a state of fear for the man they loved, the request seemed not just reasonable but necessary. They were not giving money to a stranger. They were helping their partner, the future father of their children, escape a life-threatening situation. They would apply for the credit card, and Simon would begin to spend. And he spent lavishly. He would use one woman's credit card to fund the extravagant lifestyle he was using to woo the next woman. The flights on private jets, the five-star hotels, the designer clothes, the lavish dinner set was all being paid for with borrowed money from his previous victims. He was running a romantic Ponzi scheme. The money flowed in a continuous circle, from one trusting woman to the next, all of it fueling the illusion of his immense wealth. When a woman's credit card was maxed out, he would ask her to take out another, and another. He would push them to take out high-interest personal loans, convincing them it was a short-term measure. The debts would spiral, often into the tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. To keep the scheme going, he would send them falsified documents, doctored bank statements showing massive wire transfers that never arrived, a luxury watch worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that was later revealed to be a fake. He would send them checks for huge sums of money that would inevitably bounce. He was a master of the stall, the excuse, the promise that was always just around the corner. For the victims, the experience was a descent into a nightmare. They were not only left with crippling, life-altering debt, they were grappling with a profound sense of psychological violation. The man they had loved, the future they had planned, was a complete fabrication. The emotional intimacy was a performance. The shared vulnerability was a script. They had been targeted, manipulated, and discarded. One of his victims was a Norwegian graduate student named Cece Leif Gelhoy. She met him on Tinder in 2018. Their first date was a flight from London to Bulgaria on a private jet. She fell in love. Over the course of their whirlwind romance, she ended up taking out loans that totaled over $250,000. When she realized she had been conned, she was not only heartbroken and financially ruined, she was terrified. She checked herself into a psychiatric ward, fearing for her own safety. But from that point of despair, she decided to fight back. Cece Lai went to the police, but they were largely unhelpful. Transnational fraud is notoriously difficult to investigate. So she went to the press. She contacted VG, one of Norway's largest newspapers. The journalists there began a painstaking investigation. They uncovered another of Simon's victims, a Swedish woman named Pernilla Sjöholm. Pernilla hadn't been a romantic partner, but a close friend who had also been swindled out of tens of thousands of dollars. The two women, united by their shared betrayal, decided to work together with the journalists to expose him. Their story, published in a massive exposé titled The Tinder Swindler, went viral. It laid bare his entire methodology, his real name, and his history of fraud. The illusion was shattered. The final piece of the puzzle came from another victim, Elaine Charlotte, a Dutch woman who had been dating Simon for over a year. She read the article while she was still in a relationship with him. Her world collapsed. But instead of confronting him, she decided to play his own game. She pretended she still believed him. She told him she could help him sell his extensive collection of designer clothes to raise cash. In a final, karmic twist, she began to swindle the swindler, taking his expensive clothes and selling them for her own benefit, slowly recouping a fraction of the money he had stolen from her. It was she who alerted the police when she learned he was flying from Prague to Greece. In July 2019, Shimon Hayat, aka Simon Leviev, was arrested at the airport in Athens, using a fraudulent passport. He was extradited back to Israel to face the charges he had fled years earlier. For the fraud he had committed across Europe, a scheme that had netted him an estimated $10 million from victims across the continent. He faced no charges. The transnational nature of his crimes made prosecution nearly impossible. For his original Israeli crimes of theft and forgery, he was sentenced to just 15 months in prison. He was released after serving only 5. Upon his release, Shimon Hayat returned to the life he had always craved. He offered a business course online, charging hundreds of dollars for his advice. He continued to present himself as a successful businessman, a victim of a misunderstanding. He has never been held financially or legally accountable for the devastation he wrought upon the women he conned. His victims are still, to this day, paying off the massive debts he accrued in their names. The story of the Tinder swindler is a quintessentially modern tale of imposture. It shows how the traditional markers of identity, a name, a history, a physical presence, can be rendered meaningless in a digital world. Simon Leviev was not a person. He was a brand, an illusion constructed from carefully selected images and expertly crafted lies. He understood the currency of the digital age, that the appearance of success is often more potent than success itself. He exploited not just the systems of finance, but the deepest human desire for connection, turning love itself into the ultimate con. His is a story that serves as a chilling warning about the ghosts in the machine and the devastating cost of swiping right on a beautiful lie. From the desperate boy seeking a family's love to the brilliant charlatan chasing status. From the man who stumbled into a murder mystery to the digital phantom who built an empire on broken hearts. The impostor holds up a strange and distorted mirror to our own world. They reveal our vulnerabilities, our willingness to believe, and the power of a well-told story. They live in the space between who we are and who we wish we were. And their lives, built on a foundation of lies, serve as a profound and often tragic reminder of the enduring, and sometimes desperate, human search for an identity worth claiming. For now, from all of us at the Crime Folio, we wish you a safe and peaceful night. Sleep well.